Topic today is Twilight Struggle, the Cold War as a strategy game. My name is Antti Helin, and kind of the qualifications that I'm here for, or my qualifications to talk about this topic are, well, one, I've played Twilight Struggle, the game, since about 10 years ago. I'm not a very good player of Twilight Struggle, but I have played it a fair amount. I also have a master's degree in political science, and one of my interests is the political history of the United States, and especially the political history of the United States in the 20th century. And obviously the Cold War as a theme fits pretty well into the political history of the United States, especially modern political history. But again, as a caveat, I'm not very good at Twilight Struggle. I have a suspicion that there are a lot of people in this room who would probably beat me handily in Twilight Struggle, so please don't take strategy advice from me as such. As far as strategy goes, we're going on a pretty basic level here today. So let's start with what is Twilight Struggle. The picture here is from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address from 1961, because the phrase Twilight Struggle is actually a quote from Kennedy's inaugural address. And he, of course, was referring to the Cold War and the ideological battle between the Western and the Eastern blocs. So that's why Kennedy's here in picture form. So it's a card-driven strategy game published by GMT Games in 2005, so about 13 years ago. I actually have a copy of it over there, although that's the second printing, not the first printing. It was designed by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews. On that note, on Ananda Gupta, he actually went on to design a computer game called XCOM. Some might be familiar with it. Jason Matthews, in turn, went on to and has been designing a bunch of other card-driven strategy games, including 1960, The Making of the President, which has a very similar mechanic to this game, and also very close to my heart, but the topic as such is a little more niche, so I decided against talking about that at Ropecon this year. This game has been ranked #1 on Board Game Geek for 5 years. I think it was 2011 to 2016. Currently it's ranked #5. I think at least Terraforming Mars has beat it, which is fair enough. Terraforming Mars is a pretty good game. Other games that are similar, that are kind of the antecedents or the forefathers of Twilight Struggle are, among others, you have We the People, which is about the American Revolution, published in '93. Hannibal, Rome vs. Carthage, published in 1996. And Paths of Glory, which is about the First World War, which was published in 1999. And actually, according to the designers, and I kind of see where they're coming from, the game has also been influenced by El Grande, which was published in '95, and which is kind of like a very classic Euro game. There are a lot of Eurogame elements in Twilight Struggle, as we're going to see today. And actually, how many in this room have played Twilight Struggle before? Raise your hand. So about a half. That's fine, because I'm actually going to do a quick overview of how the game plays, so that the people who haven't played it before can also follow along with like the meat of the presentation today. So how to play. Some basic stuff about how to play the game. Both players pick a side. One side is the United States, naturally, and one side is the Soviet Union, or the USSR. The game is split into 10 turns. Every turn represents about, let's say, 4 or 5 historical years, but that's not terribly relevant. The game can end before turn 10, so you don't always play until the end of turn 10. We are going to come back to that later, how can the game end. A typical game between experienced players takes maybe 2 hours to complete, maybe more, sometimes even less. If you have players who are inexperienced, the game might take a lot of time, or it might be over very quickly, and I'll explain a little later how that can happen. Each turn is split into action rounds. Turns 1 through 3 have 6 action rounds, and then from then on, every turn has 7 action rounds. The Soviet player goes first in every round, and this is actually going to come into play in many occasions. This gives the USSR an intrinsic advantage in the game, because they always have the initiative going into every action round in every turn. And this means that in more serious play, from what I can remember, often the players bid points or influence who gets to play the who has to play the United States and who gets to play the USSR. So the player who picks USSR might give 1 or 2 points as a handicap to the US player. When you play a round, you basically play a card. A card can be played for operations, which is a printed number on the card. We're going to be talking about cards a lot soon. Or you can play the card as an event. So every card you play has a printed number. Well, almost every card has a printed number that represents the power of that card. Or it has an event, which is printed text. And when you're playing a card, you typically, sometimes or often you choose between triggering the event or playing the card for the operations points. The cards, you can also have a scoring card, which means that a certain area on the map is scored. The next slide is the map, so that's going to give a better idea of what I'm talking about. When you have these operations points, you can use them to either place influence points in a country to try to take this country over. You can use it to stage a coup d'etat in a country to try to swap the influence, or rather to kind of remove an opposing player's influence and replace it with your own. Or you can do a realignment, which means that the players roll dice, and whoever gets more dice, whoever has the highest result after modifiers, increases their influence in the country. The most common use for ops points is placing influence in a country. The second most common is staging a coup d'etat, and the realignment is probably the rarest, although some games might get weird sometimes. Here's a picture of the map. The board, actually. This is the game board, and the game board mostly consists of a map of the world. The map is not a faithful representation of the planet during the Cold War in political or cultural terms. For instance, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg have been combined into one country called Benelux, for example. Or Ireland has ceased to exist. Or there are these bundled together regions like South African states and Saharan states and so on. So it's not a faithful representation of the world map as such. So we're basically going to run through like all of the elements that you see here on the map in turn to get an idea of how the game plays. But ultimately, we're talking about two players fighting for influence on a big map of the world. So how the play goes is you play cards. At the start of each turn, both players draw their hands up to 8 or 9. So basically, they have as many cards as they will play actions in that round, in that turn, excuse me, +2, which means that you typically don't have to play every single card from your hand, which is usually a good thing. Most cards have a side, either the US or the USSR, and there are also neutral cards that don't have a side. If the card is played by the matching side, so if I'm the US player and I have a US card and it has an event on it, I have to pick between playing the card for the ops points printed on the card, or I can elect to trigger the event. I can't do both at the same time. On the other hand, if I'm the US player and I have an USSR card, then I have to choose. Actually, no, then I can only play the operations points. Excuse me. I can only play the operations points, and the event is going to trigger regardless. So if you play a card with the opposing player's event, the event is triggered regardless if the event's requirements are met. Yeah, if the card is not played by the matching side, then they have to use it for operations and the event will trigger. There are going to be exceptions. This is a card game, and there are a lot of exceptions printed on the cards or on different mechanics that are going to get you out of the trouble of having to play a card and trigger an event that you don't want to trigger. On the next slide, I have a couple of examples, like basic examples of cards from Twilight Struggle. The first card is called Red Scare/Purge. This card, when we talk about cards in Twilight Struggle, they kind of have this representational value. They represent something about the Cold War, and then they have the actual mechanical element in them. This card is a neutral card. It has a white and red star, and its ops value is 4. This is a very powerful card. 4 is the largest ops number that a card can have. The numbers go from 1 to 4, so this is a very powerful card already from the ops value. and it has an event that says that all further operations cards played by your opponent this turn have -1 to their value, to a minimum value of 1. So you can play this card in two ways, since it's a neutral card. You can elect to use it as an event, which means that the opposing player gets this -1 to all their cards for the rest of the turn, or you can use it for the ops value. So this is probably one of the strongest cards in the game, because if you play this very early in a turn, like let's say a turn has 7 rounds left and you play this card, then the opponent in effect loses something between maybe 4 to 6 operations points for that turn, which can be a very significant problem for the opposing player, especially very early in the game where the marginal value of operations points is higher. Here's another card from the mid-war called Allende. This is an event where the USSR receives 2 influence in Chile. The USSR typically probably likes to play this as an event in the sense that the 1 operations is not usually as valuable as getting 2 influence in Chile, especially because as the USSR it might be very difficult to get influence in Chile in the first place. This has an asterisk in the name, unlike Red Scare. This is because if this is used as an event when it's played, it's removed from the game completely. So it can happen only once. And third, another card, this is called North Sea Oil. It prevents the play of another event. So some cards might allow the play of some other card, or they might prevent the play of some other card. That's why I have North Sea Oil here as an example. So it basically disables an event called OPEC. And the event OPEC gives the USSR points if they control countries that produce a lot of oil, basically. So the thematic idea here is that, well, once the UK can extract oil from the North Sea, then the Western Bloc is not as dependent on the OPEC countries for oil production, and that makes life for the Western Bloc easier. And also it has an added bonus effect that the US can play 8 cards on that turn, so they kind of get an extra action if they choose to use it. And this again is removed from play if it's used as an event. So there are, I think there are 110 cards in the game, and all the cards have some kind of printed effect on them, and then the way you play the game is you play these cards and choose how to use the cards, and then the cards have all these kinds of interesting interplays with each other. At the beginning of each turn, both players choose 1 card from their hand, which is played as a so-called headline event, which means that the card's event is triggered. It's not an action round. This basically is there so that players actually trigger events instead of just playing for operations points, because especially good players usually prefer to play operations points unless the event is really good, because operations points are very nice to have. Cards are drawn from a separate draw pile and then discarded into a discard pile. And then if the draw pile is exhausted, the discard pile is shuffled into a new one. This is important because you kind of have to keep track of where the cards are if you want to be really good at Twilight Struggle, which cards are in the discard, which cards have been removed from the game, and which cards are still waiting to be drawn from the draw pile. The cards are also grouped by their phase of the game into early war cards, mid-war cards, and late war cards. So for instance, there was this card North Sea Oil. It said late war in it, which means that it's not brought into the game until turn 8. So you can't draw and play North Sea Oil in like turn 4 because, well, basically the oil in the North Sea wasn't, I presume, discovered in the 1950s. So this way, there's kind of like this rough chronology of how the events in the game happen to kind of follow the historical pattern. So, for example, after turn 3 is finished and the early war phase is over, the draw pile and the mid-war cards are shuffled into a new draw pile. So the mid-war cards are then introduced into the game. About placing influence. So, like we saw, the game is played on an abstracted map of the world with countries that are connected by lines that represent political and cultural ties. And basically, typically placing influence into a country costs 1 operations point per influence, and you need to have influence in a neighboring country to be able to place influence in another country. This is why I said for the USSR it might be difficult to get influence into Chile, because if you do it using the traditional way, you have to have influence in a country that is already connected to Chile. And then Chile is all the way down in South America, and at least in the early war it's very difficult, for example, for the USSR to get into South America. Depends on the game, of course. So you place influence into a country, and that gives the superpower control of the country. There's a stability value for the country, which can go from 1 to 5. And once a superpower has more influence in a country than the other superpower that is equal to the stability of the country, then that superpower controls that country. So let's say we have Finland. Finland is a country with a stability of 4. If the USSR have 4 influence in Finland, then they control Finland. But if the US also has 1 influence in Finland, then the USSR only have 3 more influence in Finland than the US, which means that they don't control the country. Basically, it just means that there are certain countries that are harder to take over than others. The map is also, some countries are called battlegrounds, and some are basically non-battlegrounds. Battlegrounds are more important for scoring. I'll talk about scoring in a couple of slides. The map is divided into regions, so you have Europe, Asia, Middle East, Africa, Central America, and South America. And there are also 3 subregions: Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. And the idea of splitting into regions is that regions are scored. So an entire region is scored when it's time to score a region, not just single countries, but the whole region is looked at, like who has more influence in this, who has more control in this region than the other superpower, and then points are given based on that. Here's a close-up of Europe on the game board. So there you have Benelux, like I said, and there you also have Finland up there in the north, with its stability value of 4. And here you can also see how Europe has been divided into 2 sub-regions. The darker shade is Western Europe, and the lighter shade is Eastern Europe. This is mostly significant for some events. For instance, there is a card called Warsaw Pact, which allows the USSR to place influence or remove influence from Eastern Europe, but not Western Europe. So if you play Warsaw Pact, you won't be able to do anything to West Germany with the Warsaw Pact, which makes sense. Besides placing influence, you can also use operations points to do coup d'etats or realignments. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but basically what happens with coups and realignments is that you roll dice, and you can influence the modifier that you get from the dice, either by playing a very valuable card, or in the case of realignments, by having a lot of countries that are under your control that are connected to the target country. And if you roll your dice well, then you get a nice result, and then if you roll very poorly, then you get a not so nice result. So it's a way to kind of break into countries, especially countries that are very low in stability. For example, I was using the example of Finland. Based on this formula, it's very difficult to have a coup d'etat in Finland and actually succeed. On the other hand, you have countries like Angola, which has a stability of 1. So these countries are very easy to stage a coup d'etat in and swap the opposing player's influence for your own. And it kind of reflects the fact that if you have these low stability countries in Central Africa, for example, then they are more likely to swap hands during the game than these very high stability countries in Europe. Speaking of coup d'etats, there's also another mechanic in the game called the DEFCON track, or defense readiness condition track. This might be familiar from some movies like war games. The game starts at DEFCON 5, and there are events, or if you do a coup d'etat in a battleground country, that degrades the DEFCON track by 1. All events or coups degrade by 1 at a time. I don't think there's an event that degrades by 2. There are 2 functions for DEFCON. One is that if DEFCON is low, then certain regions are blocked from coup d'etats and realignments. So, for example, if DEFCON is at 4, 3, or 2, then you're not allowed to have a coup d'etat in a European country. Africa, Central America, and South America are places where coup d'etats are always okay. They're not restricted. Another important facet about the DEFCON track is that if DEFCON drops at DEFCON 2 to DEFCON 1, then the game ends. You have started nuclear war. Sorry, everyone has to go home. The game doesn't continue from that anymore. So there is a loser. Not just everyone. I mean, everyone loses in a nuclear war, but in Twilight Struggle rules, the player whose turn it is when nuclear war starts is the one who loses when nuclear war starts. And there's going to be a slide about this later, but this basically leads to a situation where you can accidentally start a nuclear war on your own turn and lose the game. When you spend operations points on coup d'etats, that also increases your military operations track. Military operations are important in the sense that you have to have military operations at the end of the turn. You have to have at least as many military operations on the track as the DEFCON status is, or you lose points. This is basically an incentive for the players to keep doing coup d'etats instead of keeping DEFCON at 5. Now let's see. And then there's the space race. The space race is a safety valve in this game, basically. It allows you to get rid of cards that you don't want to play. I mentioned that you can start nuclear war accidentally on your turn, or maybe less accidentally. You can start nuclear war and lose the game. You can play a card that could cause you to lose the game actually on the space race track, and this way get rid of it. There are some bonuses you can get, especially if you're ahead on the space race. Generally, the rule is that you can send one card to space per turn. So you draw a hand, and there's typically like only one card that you can safely get rid of through the space race. If you're very ahead on the space race, if you're a little ahead on the space race, you might be able to send 2 cards to space in one turn. But basically, it's a way to get rid of nasty cards. Scoring. Scoring cards are interesting in that they are drawn like event cards. And I'm seeing the El Grande influence here a little, because if you played El Grande, the scoring actually happens throughout the game. You don't go to the end of the game and then score the game. You have scoring events happen throughout the game. And Twilight Struggle works a little similar in that sense. But the key difference is that the players get to decide when they play the scoring card. When you draw a scoring card on a turn, you have to play it before the end of that turn. You can't keep it in your hand at the end of the turn. You have to have played it, or you lose the game. This is of course on gentleman's rules, or maybe in some official events they have someone peering behind your back making sure that you're playing the scoring card. But if you draw a scoring card, you have to play it, which sucks in the sense that it takes the place of a card that has something nice that you can do with it instead. The trade-off is that you know that the region is going to be scored, and you get to decide when in that turn it's going to be scored. So you have this small information advantage. Scoring cards are discarded after they've been played, so they're going to keep coming back to the game after they've been played, with the exception of one special scoring card, Southeast Asia scoring, which is removed once it's been played. So this one single region is only scored once in the entire game. Maybe it's never scored. That's also possible. So the players get to dictate when the regions are scored, at least within a turn, but the random draw is what dictates like what turn some region is scored in. And this is again an important reason to keep track in your head during play of where the scoring cards are, because that means that if you know that Europe scoring has been played, then you know that I don't need to focus on Europe that much because it's already been scored recently. Okay, finally, how do you win this game? There's a score track. If the marker on the score track is on your side at the end of the game, then you win. At the end of the game, all the regions are automatically scored one more time, except Southeast Asia, of course. Or you push the score track all the way to your end. I'm going to have a picture of the score track, so this is going to be a little more easier. But if you push the score track to your end of the track, then you also automatically win. If you have 20 points on your side of the track, then you automatically win the game. This can happen if one player is having a very bad time in the game. If global thermonuclear war starts, then you lose the game if it starts on your turn, or if you force the opponent to start nuclear war on their turn, then you win the game. If you control Europe, if you have control of all the battleground countries in Europe when Europe is scored, then you also automatically win the game. If you play an event called War Games, it allows you to win the game. Well, you can win the game with War Games. Basically, War Games works such that if DEFCON is at 2, you can give your opponent 6 points and then end the game. So if you're ahead by more than 6 points and DEFCON is at 2, then you can use this to instantly win the game for yourself. It comes into play in the late war. So the length of the game can vary. Some games can last until the end of turn 10, so you play for a couple of hours and you get to the end of turn 10 and then you score all the regions and then you see who won. But the game can end in, let's say, in the mid-war on like turn 5 or 6, because one player basically runs away with the game. Like they get to their end of the scoring track and there's not much you can do about it. That can also happen. Or the game could even end on turn 1, if one player is very, very bad at Twilight Struggle and triggers nuclear war on their turn. Then the game can end very quickly. That's what I was referring to earlier when I said that if you have very inexperienced players, the game can go past very quickly. Here's a picture of the scoring track. So if the US gets points, then the marker is moved towards their end of the track, and then if the USSR gets points, it's moved to their end of the track. And if the marker goes to either 20 on the USSR side or 20 on the USA side, then that side wins. So, in summary, when playing Twilight Struggle, what is Twilight Struggle about? It's a game of controlling territory or space. It's a game of managing resources, and it's a game of asymmetric information, because you don't know what the other player has. You can make guesses, but you don't really know, unless there's some card that allows you to cheat. There are also elements of managing risk and taking risks, like those dice rolls related to the coups d'etat and realignments. There are some risks there, or you might have to take some risky plays based on the information that you have. Like, let's say the game is at plus 18 for the USSR and you think that the USSR is going to score some region, then you have to start playing very riskily and try to take that region back so that they can't score that region and win the game instantly. There's a very steep learning curve, which is like one of the nice things and one of the bad things about this game is that when you're teaching this game to a new player, the new player is going to be pretty lost at sea because there are 110 cards, and you have to have a pretty good idea at least of what cards there are and when they enter the game to be good at the game. So it does also give you this very nice sense of mastery of the game once you have a good idea of the different cards and you can kind of see into the future and guess what's going to happen in the game, at least to a rough extent. The game is not, like I mentioned earlier, it's not perfectly balanced because the USSR has initiative every turn. One interesting dynamic is, though, that the game starts with the USSR having a very strong position and the cards are very in favor of the USSR. But as the game progresses towards the late war, the events actually start to slightly favor the US, which kind of has a historical parallel. So kind of as the US, at least when I play as the US, like my goal is mostly to survive, to make it to the rest of the game, and then usually the tide starts turning when you get to the rest of the game. And because we have cards, one nice thing about the cards is that they allow you to break the rules of the game. So there might be cards that create exceptions to the established rules, to the standard rules of the game. And one nice thing about these cards is that, well, it says right there on the card what the exception to the rules is. So you don't have to go look at the manual and see what the exceptions to the different rules are. They're just printed on the cards. So, okay, we've talked about how to play the game. Let's get to the actual facet of how do you turn the theme of the Cold War into a game mechanic. Quick disclaimer here, which is that this game, of course, is not a realistic or historical representation of the Cold War, in the sense that you could even debate whether there was a Cold War. All the different misrepresentations or the hidden ideologies of Twilight Struggle are maybe a topic for another presentation, maybe next year, but not this year. And from the designer's note, the designers themselves acknowledge that the game basically accepts the internal logic of the Cold War, that there's this, that the only relationships that matter in the game are between a nation and the superpowers, and the world is just this big chessboard for the superpowers to play on. So the designers themselves acknowledge that this is kind of like a pop culture version of the Cold War and not necessarily any kind of objective reality of the Cold War. So in the context of today, we're basically also buying into this internal logic of the Cold War as the struggle between two global superpowers, and we're not going to worry about things like the non-aligned movement with India and Yugoslavia and stuff like that. I mean, even China, which was a very significant, which had a very significant role in the Cold War, has been abstracted into a couple of cards in the game. So, when I've played Twilight Struggle, what's always struck me is that the game is able to engender the feeling and the atmosphere of the Cold War. The Cold War itself is a very influential phenomenon, and even those who haven't really directly experienced it have like learned about and have been exposed to it through popular culture. So we kind of have an idea what the Cold War is on some level, even if we never necessarily lived through the Cold War. I'm not going to presume, but I was like 4 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, so I don't remember much of anything about it. So what are the kinds of emotions or feelings you might associate with the Cold War? There's paranoia, of course. There's tension, fear, and anxiety, the ever-present threat of nuclear war. There's uncertainty and doubt about the future, what's going to happen next, what's going to happen with Vietnam, what's going to happen with Afghanistan. So how are these emotions translated into game mechanics to kind of recreate this feel of the Cold War when you're playing it? And that's what we're going to explore for the rest of this presentation. So at the core is dilemma. This is a direct quote from one of the designers, Jason Matthews. Like, the core of Twilight Struggle is dilemma, having to make choices. It's a game of resource management and hand management. One very common experience I have when I play this game is that I draw a hand of cards and then I go, oh god, what am I going to do with these cards? Like, these are all terrible. What am I going to do next? How am I going to be able to deal with this? I'm going to lose this game if I can't figure something out. So every turn you kind of have this puzzle that you have to solve. You have 7, 8, 9 cards and you have to decide, well, what the hell am I going to do with these cards? How am I going to deal with this situation? And that probably reflects some of the, maybe some of the frustration that some people might have experienced during the Cold War, even geopolitical leaders. Also, players need to prioritize based on the limited information they have, and what they have in their hands, what cards have they seen, what they haven't seen. And that's another dilemma that they face. And then, like, for example, I've included this card, socialist governments, because there are different ways you can approach this card. You could send this to space, or you could play the card, and then when the USSR removes the influence, you just use the operations points of the card to put all the influence back in. Or you do something completely different with the card. Maybe you don't care about influence in Western Europe. You want to play the operations points and put them into some other region, and then the USSR player just removes the influence from Western Europe, and you don't care. That's the kind of choice you have to make. It's a constant barrage of choices that you're faced with. You also have to manage your hand and keep an eye on the deck. The reason I titled this section was John Paul II Goes to Space, is that sometimes John Paul II really has to go to space because he's actually a card in this game and you may not want to play that card always. So John Paul gets to go to space, or Fidel Castro gets to go to space. So there's always this set of decisions that you have to make, and you have a wide variety of very different kinds of decisions to make. Sometimes you can neutralize a card by playing the operations points on the card, or sometimes it's better to send them to space. So here's John Paul. The reason to send John Paul into space is that, one, it gives the US influence in Poland, which gives the US kind of an inside track, a way to infiltrate Eastern Europe. And the other is that it allows the play of another event, which is very nasty. So if you send the Pope to space, then the nasty event Solidarity can't happen, at least until someone plays this card and triggers the event. So, and sometimes it's just better to bite the bullet and actually play the card and trigger the event, and then it goes away from the draw deck and you don't have to worry about it again. There are some cards that it's better to kind of do this controlled removal of the card and get rid of it and then move on with your life. So, DEFCON traps. One major source of tension, which I think is very, very true to the theme of the game, is the DEFCON track. Players have very strong incentives to push DEFCON status to 2, but on the other hand, if you are constantly at DEFCON 2, then that means that it's way more likely that it goes to 1 and someone accidentally causes a nuclear war. So there's this constant sense that, well, we have to keep tensions high, but we can't keep them too high, because if the tensions go too high, then something awful is going to happen. There are many cards or events that become these so-called DEFCON traps when DEFCON is at 2, and then you have to find some way to deal with this card if DEFCON is at 2, or you have to find a way to increase DEFCON. So you can kind of think of these as these political crises that come at the most unfortunate moment, and then you have to figure out, well, how do we avoid nuclear destruction without, how do I deal with this situation without causing nuclear destruction? Which is very similar to like you had the Berlin crisis in 1961, or the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and so on. Here's an example of a DEFCON trap. It's a US event, and it degrades DEFCON by 1 level. If DEFCON is at 2, and you are the USSR, and you play this card, you're going to lose the game if you play it as an event, or if you trigger the event, because it's going to drop DEFCON to 1, and then you lose the game. The title and the picture is referenced. You can find this on YouTube. It's an American educational video about what to do in the event of a nuclear attack, which is basically duck and cover and hope for the best. So this is kind of a reproduction of the frostier phases of the Cold War when everyone was worried that nuclear war is going to happen. I like DEFCON traps, so I have a couple of more DEFCON traps here. They're also very thematic. We have Lone Gunman, which is a reference to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. If this is played as an event, and if you are the US player, and if DEFCON is at 2, then this card is going to allow the USSR player to conduct operations, do a coup d'etat, and push DEFCON to 1, and the US player has lost the game. Or we have Soviet shoot down Kal 007, which was a passenger jet that was shot down by the Soviet Air Force in 1983, I think. And this is kind of another example. If you are the USSR player and DEFCON is at 2, and you play this game, play this card, then you lose the game. Or 5-year plan, this basically can trigger another card to happen on your turn. I'm not going to go too deeply into that because there's a limited amount of time left. So, information asymmetry, of course, a very important facet of the Cold War as well. You don't know what your opponent has in their hand. You can make educated guesses. You can also try to bluff, like you can start pushing influence into a region and then kind of bluff your opponent into thinking that you have the scoring card for that region, and then the opponent overcommits into that region and then you score somewhere else. And there are cards that can kind of kick one country out of, kick one player out of a country. So as long as that card is kind of wild there, like de Gaulle hasn't been played, and de Gaulle is a card which can kick the US out of France, then that means that the US doesn't want to go into France until de Gaulle has been played. And then there's the card War Games, which I described earlier. So when the late war starts and the other player has like a lead of 7, 8, 9 points and DEFCON is at 2, then the real paranoia sets in because you have to start worrying whether the other guy has war games, is he going to play that and win the game. And then you have to keep thinking about, well, how can I get within 6 points of my opponent, or how can I push DEFCON higher so the DEFCON is not at 2, and that can actually make you commit to plays that are going to lose you the game because you lose control of some region because you are so laser focused on stopping war games from happening. And yeah, scoring is another element of information asymmetry. I've kind of covered this topic already, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Also, the event cards shape the chronology of the game, which is another thematic component. So the cards kind of dictate that in the early war, the focus is a lot on Europe. But then in the mid-war, the struggle becomes more global and Europe becomes very static. But then in the late war, Europe becomes more dynamic again, which again represents the fact that in the real Cold War, it was the end of the Cold War when Europe kind of started to get unglued and for the Eastern Bloc to start falling apart. And another thing is that in the early and mid-war, DEFCON is often very low, but then at the end of the game, DEFCON starts going up again, which is again an example of how in the late 80s, the superpower relations in that sense weren't as tense as they had been before because Gorbachev was running the show. Okay, so finally, I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to hurry through to the final section, which is about these alternate scenarios that can happen when you're playing Twilight Struggle. The game doesn't have cards based on alternate history, but the fact that the cards can happen, or they might not happen, or they might happen out of order is a way for alternate history to be created in a game of Twilight Struggle. So even though there aren't any strictly counterfactual cards in the game, there can be, when you play a card called like the Warsaw Pact in 1985 and you trigger the event, it's going to have a different context. Or at least when I'm playing the game, I kind of think that, well, if you're forming the Warsaw Pact in 1985 and not 1955, it's going to be something different than the original Warsaw Pact. Or if you have a card like the Reformer, which kind of represents Gorbachev, but it could also represent any other Soviet leader that is trying to reform the USSR at the end of the Cold War to stop disaster from happening. One fun thing I've also noticed is that the space race actually kind of falls short of the real space race, because players typically try to avoid playing into the space race and use the cards for operations points instead. This is kind of, as a rocket person myself, it's of course kind of awkward that it implies that the space race was not a very good use of resources. Those resources by rational actors probably would have been spent elsewhere. So maybe we wouldn't get to go to the moon if the superpowers had actually thought about what they were doing. But the good thing is that they didn't. The game also kind of allows you to see into the future, because like I've talked about being able to kind of know the deck and know the cards and know what's going to happen in the game. So you kind of get this sense of precognition that you know what's roughly going to happen in the game in the future. This also means that when new players are playing the game, it's actually very interesting to watch, because they don't have this gift of precognition, so they can do some very random and interesting things. So in that sense, it's fun to watch two players who are new to the game try to play it, because it can have very interesting outcomes. Whereas if you have very experienced players, the games kind of tend to go the same way. Well, not the same way every time, but they kind of follow the accepted meta game of Twilight Struggle, which is very similar to the real Cold War. Also, like the game has, like we've talked about with DEF CON, there's this idea of getting very close to nuclear war and only barely avoiding it. So even though nuclear war is a very central element of the game, nuclear war is not a good thing, which is kind of, some games are very like they don't care about the Cold War as much, but in this game the Cold War is bad. It's also that inexperienced players are more likely to cause nuclear war. And when you think about the historical leaders and the fact that they got it right the first time, that's actually kind of impressive. Survivor bias notwithstanding. I'm going to rush through to the end here. So, does theme matter? I found that the Cold War lends itself well to gamifying, and game metaphors are very common when people talk about the Cold War and geopolitics. Also, Twilight Struggle is kind of like this cultural representation of the Cold War. So in that sense, it's very accessible, because people kind of know what the Cold War is. They've learned about it in school, so it's very easy for them to get into a game of Twilight Struggle. I also suspect that if someone is a very good expert on the Cold War and they come new into the game, they might be a little better off than someone who doesn't know anything about the Cold War. And that means that the theme does matter, because if you know the theme well, then you're going to have a small edge. I'm not saying it's a very significant edge, but I think there is going to be a small edge. If you took the theme away, it's not going to be the same way, same kind of game. It's not going to be the same game. So, well, there's the atmosphere, I already talked about it. So there's this popular cultural Cold War, and it has a very strong atmosphere that is also available in Twilight Struggle. And DEF CON and the military operations track and the headline phase and the scoring cards are kind of all these implementations of the Cold War tensions and anxieties and fears into a game mechanic, which I think is very impressive. So I think these are the reasons why Twilight Struggle is so popular. It's an accessible theme, people know what the Cold War is, and it's also this very, very psychological and emotional approach to the Cold War, which makes it very comprehensible for someone playing it. I could even imagine that if someone doesn't really know much about the Cold War, after playing this game for a while, they're going to absorb this second-hand Cold War, even if they never experienced it. They're going to have this sense of what the Cold War might be like. Yeah, so that's why I suspect this game is so popular and so highly ranked on Board Game Geek compared to games that have little more obscure themes like the Reformation or the American Revolution. Yeah, that's me. That's all for me. There's my Twitter, and on that Twitter I've posted a link to these slides today. So if you go to that Twitter, you should be able to get the SlideShare link, and you can look at the slides through there. And there's also a list of the sources that I used to craft this presentation. Especially Twilight Strategy. TwilightStrategy.com is a really good website. I recommend it for everyone who's into this game. Okay, there's 1 minute left. Is there a question? There in the back.
What usually happens to Finland in the game?
Nothing. No one really, in my experience, no one really plays into Finland. Finland is not important in this game. There.
What do you think about the optional cards? I think those are NORAD and
AWACS? And Cambridge 5 and I think AWACS is an optional card.
Maybe the war games. So do you think the game is better off including them all?
I like the optional cards. I almost always play with the optional cards on. I especially like Cambridge 5 because the story of Kim Philbin is very interesting to me, and he was one of the Cambridge 5. It was aspiring in the UK that kind of revealed all the secrets to the USSR. Okay, time is up. Thank you so much everyone for joining me today, and have a nice weekend and the rest of the con. Thank you.